I think in coaching research, in so many ways, it feels like we just don't do God. It's the topic of non-discussion in our world.
Because it seems counterproductive to a scientific enterprise. It's in a world of understanding. If you can't understand something, it doesn't seem like worth talking about. Yeah. Hi everyone, welcome to this episode of Labours of Sports Coaching. Now today I was joined by Don Vinson, who is a Professor of Sports Coaching at the University of Worcester. We talk about a very interesting and probably overlooked subject space, in that we discuss leadership theory, which you might go, straight away, that's actually very common, we see a lot of that, but we discuss specifically servant leadership. Okay, and we actually utilise Christian faith as a case study for how Christian servant leadership can be utilised within sports coaching. Well, actually, shining a light on how coaches who are of faith grapple with some of the problematic elements of sport and talent development. But it's not a conversation that is trying to exclude anyone who maybe isn't of faith. It's actually a really powerful example of how value structures that are very ingrained in value structures that are that serve a purpose beyond ourselves as individuals can actually bring coaches closer towards what I think athlete-centred coaching was intended to be, but actually I think, considering the more ecological system that it sits within, with sport being an institution in such a way, doesn't actually conform or isn't actually conducive to a holistic development for our athletes, and doesn't actually sit well with coaches and how they self-manage and all those sorts of things. So it's a really powerful conversation to have. A paper that came out a while ago but deserves to be brought back into the spotlight, if you will, and I really just hope that people are open to this conversation, and I want them to, and I would love for you guys to listen and see what can be learned from our conversation as we get into talking about spirituality and its place in sports coaching for those with a Christian belief, but also for those who maybe come from different backgrounds or different religions or faith, or maybe not even a faith, but have a real care for their athlete and want to really be holistic in how they deal with the different conundrums that sport can bring up for their athletes. So please enjoy it. Please listen to it, be open-minded to it, and let us know what you think. So yeah, we'll get into it. So Don, it's great to have you. How are you, just to start?
Superbly well, thank you, Mark. Yeah, delighted to be here and looking forward to a good chat about some interesting things, hopefully.
I know, but actually in the run-up to this conversation, it's been quite reflective for me, actually, because obviously we're going to speak today about a topic that I think is overlooked a little bit, even though it impacts quite a large demographic of coaches, not just specific to the UK, but across the world, and that we're talking about the relationship between Christian views of living and spirituality, and maybe how that sits in alignment or doesn't sit in alignment with the mission that a sports coach has, and how they sort of go about their day-to-day lives. And as someone, like, full transparency, I'm a Catholic and a practicing Catholic at that, and someone that's actually maybe returned to their faith after a while, perhaps have been a bit disconnected from it, is something I've been thinking a bit more deeply around, is that role. But I don't think it's necessarily it's not necessarily to just close the conversation up to only those that have faith. It's actually a very interesting topic because it positions philosophy of thought and actually provides a case study for how people act on their anchor points and how they investigate some of the conflict within that. So you're going to be the best person to tell me about that, because the study, it came out 2020 and it's been a few years since, but it's so prominent still and so prevalent. So we're going to try and explore that today, if you can, with me. So I think maybe a good starting point for this is, what was the inspiration for the work? Why did you decide that this is something that's worth pursuing in an academic light to begin with?
So I think there are a number of answers to that, different streams that fed into this block of work, and as we might discuss, influence where I've gone with it since, and what perhaps is the rationale for why I'm doing what I'm doing at the moment, and we'll talk about a little bit of that as we go on. But in terms of this paper and its inspiration, firstly, was a passion for coaching, and that's just who I am, and that's my life. I love coaching, and trying to find I love your phrase, good anchor points for how we can bed our coaching philosophy, for want of a better term. I know that's a point of debate at the moment, but so how we can do coaching or how we can live coaching. And so I wanted to talk about that. And I felt that this tool of servant leadership was a superbly both interesting but insightful framework to speak into coaching. And that came from a very practical sense for me. You know, I'm a practicing coach. I'm passionate about coaching. And for lots of years before this paper, I would have said this framework of servant leadership just speaks to me at a really deep level. That came out of a conversation that I had with one of my coaching role models, Jane Powell, who said to me about 20 years ago now, she was leading a coaching course that I was taking way back in 2005, something like that, 20 years ago. Wow. And she said to me at that time, she said, Don, you've got to stop coaching hockey. Pause for dramatic effect as that sunk in. And then she said, you've got to start coaching people. And that's trite in a way, isn't it? And she knew that it was, and she was being a little bit provocative. But at that time, in my early days of getting into coaching and learning what coaching is, it really spoke to me, and you can tell it stuck in my mind. And that shifted. It was a breakthrough moment in my coaching to think, oh, of course it is. I'm coaching people, and hockey is the mechanism. And very quickly, I aligned myself to models like servant leadership, which speak to that element so much more profoundly than perhaps I'd engaged with before. So that practical sense was one inspiration, and I'd known this theory for quite some time. It is one of the things that I've taught at university in our leadership models for a long time, and I love it, and it speaks to me. We'll probably get into that, and then the more, I guess, current view of my current position in coaching is bringing to the fore more and more problems with our system, I guess, and this is reflective, I think, of contemporary culture. And what I mean by that is, as I go through my role in hockey and leading the under-16 program for England hockey, it is unquestionable that we are getting more and more profound and more frequent issues with young people who are struggling to manage life, and it's mental health problems, and it is wrestles over all those different elements that feed into that. And I know we're not going to get into that in great depth today, but it was definitely an inspiration for this line of work to think we need to be a bit disruptive about how we're doing coaching, talent development, and coaching in the talent development space, because young people are struggling in these spaces more and more. Just recently, there was a brilliant provocative paper that I read that was coming from the perspective of saying, well, young people in talent development spaces at the moment are more likely to be abused than not. I was going, oh my word, wow, really? And whether it was talking obviously about a whole broad range of abuses in that sense.
Spectrum.
It speaks both to the mental health aspect and its impact on young people, but it also speaks to what are we doing as coaches? What is our anchor point that gives us a good and sound ethical and moral basis for how we're coaching? So that was part of the influence here as well. And then just finally, I guess, the world of coaching, always thought, sport coaching research has been a mirror, a reflection of, I don't know if you remember, you might be too young for this. Alistair Campbell, years ago, intervened when a journalist asked Tony Blair about his faith. And apparently, we don't, whether this is true or not, I don't know, but he steps in and says with great line, we don't do God. And
okay.
That's coaching as well, isn't it? I think in coaching research in so many ways, it feels like we just don't do God. It's a topic of non-discussion in our world.
Because it seems counterproductive to a scientific enterprise. It's in a world of understanding, and if you can't understand something, it doesn't seem like worth talking about.
And I get it, because the world in which we do our coaching research is in the UK is an increasingly secular space where the place of religion is not, or discussions about God is not central to that. So it's reflective of that. But I think it's a mistake because, not mistake, it's a gap. Because very quickly, as you investigate the topic of spirituality in the broader both sports psychology but psychology literature, you find some really great claims to how beneficial spiritual health is to everybody. And you find so quickly that spiritual health is aligned to much lower instances of self-harm, a much deeper, profound sense of self-worth and identity. There are so many great benefits to having positive spiritual health. So, and I think we're maybe cutting this element out of our sport coaching discourse, which I think has potential to actually really help us. And whilst in the UK, it's an increasingly secular space. There are, and I appreciate here, there are great challenges with the position of the church, and some of the things that have happened recently give people, real pause to think: is this are these institutions good things to align to or to think about? I get that absolutely, but if you look at the world in general, you know. The vast majority of people in the world would still align to a religion of one type or other. Christianity is the biggest across the world, but once you add the others together, I was sort of in trying to find some statistics. I was looking at some systematic reviews, and the general claim: well over 80% of people in the world align to a faith of one sort or other.
Even cultural. I mean, there's cultural Christianity to a degree as well.
Yeah,
taking away that you don't necessarily believe in a divine in order to actually, still see a lot of credit and responsibility or sensibility rather on how you could act in a way that is ethical and consistent, perhaps.
Yeah, and in some ways, I wonder whether that is part of the reason why some of our coaching research perhaps doesn't have the reach that it might, because we're missing something. And why I think that's so important is, and you and I would be testament to this. If you speak to people, you say, oh, what is the most important thing in your life? Well, for people of faith, it is that. It is the most important thing in life. The reason why I do what I do, and at the core of my identity is my Christian faith. That's the most important thing, number one. And if that is true for so many people in the world, then to not speak to that in the work that we try and do, I think, well, perhaps that's why we're missing something.
And as I think if we return as well, Don, to what you said around, just the good that can come from having some sort of a conversation around spirituality. And again, it's to what extent you take that, if it's about actual religious spirituality or if it's more private spirituality. Is there something... We will, I think, for the sake of bounding the conversation, let's think about it just more strictly for now insofar as the Christian view of faith. But is there something about because when you link it to different outcomes and maybe, different affective states insofar as like quality of living or behaviour, is there something about the equilibrium that is brought about by having quite a solid value structure, and perhaps in even the way that it teaches or encourages discipline towards enacting values? Because this is really a conversation about values and about what keeps people acting in a way that's aiming upward and not down the way. Because if you don't have a value structure, you aren't able to tell up from down. And that's if you're talking about in the context of coaching and what we see is, effective leadership, it's leadership that knows right from wrong. It's leadership that understands where we're aiming towards. And that's you could only see how that's so cemented through someone that maybe is in touch with a spirituality, and I suppose within the context of this conversation, a Christian spirituality that has fairly set ways of acting and views on the ethics of behaviour. And that's what coaching is. It's a relational act. You're working with people. You're working for people, I suppose, if we're maybe it's a bit of a segue in towards the sort of servant leadership approach. But is it something to do with that, I think? Because I think that's where there's strength in faith, but there's also just in a wider view, there's strength in spirituality, or some solid investigation into your value structures as a whole. I think that's just so important.
So I've got three thoughts to reflect what you just said. One of them is directly related, and then the others have just sort of popped into my head, but I want let me say them. So, yeah, I'll get to specific Christian spirituality in the third, but just as I said, more general evidence to do with being spiritually healthy shows us that that young people who are spiritually healthy are less likely to be depressed, have lower levels of anxiety, they make less suicide attempts, less substance abuse, and it generally report having a better experience of life. And these are things that were speaking into my context in hockey. That was thinking the problems that I see in that world at the moment are directly related to, in my view, a little bit of identity work. And this is where the Christian spirituality bit kicks in, I think, because in many of the conversations I have with young people, they are really clearly and obviously seeking their worth and value and identity in my space through what they're going to achieve and hopefully wear an England shirt and play for their country, etc. And Christian spirituality speaks directly into that and says it's not about what you're going to do or how much you have to contribute to this team or what you're going to achieve in your hockey. You don't have to do anything to be valued and loved in this world. And that's the view of Christian spirituality, isn't it? To say, this in this life you are loved, and
that's also unconditional regard. That's care. That's caring coaching, isn't it? That's what he brings back to universal value. That's caring coaching. That's offering a space where that athletes can be vulnerable, that they can be who they are, not what they think you need them to be, or what others project onto them about what they should be. That's awesome. That's what we want. That's a loving and caring environment. So it just shows it, isn't it, I suppose, and how that can translate into good outcomes. And again, this is before we talk about the competitive ethos of sport and other things. It helps to mitigate against the problematic elements of sport, because I wonder if that's maybe a nice time point for us to talk about what is it that is problematic about sport when viewed, not necessarily before we view it from a Christian lens, but what is it just as in a whole? What creates problems within sport for those of faith, without faith, or whatever? Does it come down to the attack on self-esteem? Does it come down to the competitive innateness of what you're doing in sport? What was this? I don't know if that was part of the inspiration as well, because you're trying to wrestle that. I think if you're a coach who is of faith, you're wrestling with that, with not trying to become part of the machine that you recognise has flaws to it, but also has a lot of transformative potential within it as well. Because I don't think competition is. It again depends on how you view events, and how you view events is going to impact how you respond to events and that rationality you bring to circumstance. So, I'd be quite keen to kind of see if that resonates, or if you can elaborate a bit on that, at least from your position, because sport it's an opportunity. These are all opportunities, and how you view, or even how you attribute events that occur and happen to you, that all has an impact on what you do next. And again, if you see that and how you view what's happening to you, if it's happening for you, and again, there's Christian ethos that connects that, then that changes the conversation. And again, I think that in itself is something that is beneficial to everyone if you have that outlet to a degree.
I think there are loads of lines we could take there on what is wrong with sport. And we should say at this point, hey, I'm in sport because we love it, and we think that there is such great value when sport is done well, and there is a great place in the life and development of young people for sport that is appropriately competitive, and so there are some great things about sport, but obviously there are some bits about our sporting systems that are quite broken as well. And part of, I think, what the rationale for this line of work to do was to just highlight some of those things and to question some of the goodness of sport, I guess. Now there is a small body of work in sport and Christianity, and some of this is largely North American. But the great sociologist Jay Coakley called uh, or coined this term sportianity as almost when sport becomes the religion of the people, and that, I guess, misshapen view of sport is the problem. And in this paper, we talked to some coaches who wrestled with that, and we might get into this in a little bit more detail. But for them, it was often about the place and position of winning in, uh, in their case, in often youth development environments. But I think this is true across the piece. To be honest, I should say, look, when we compete, um, I will always compete to win. That's the nature of the competition in which we're entering. But if you get the importance of that wrong, then I think that can skew and misshape our sporting systems, where winning becomes the end and the most important thing, as opposed to being part of the process that you're engaging in. So I think partly we have that brokenness of the system. And we've seen this in the UK over the last 10 years, haven't we, in our elite sporting systems, where some of our greatest gold medal winning machines of national governing bodies at Olympics have been hugely successful in winning medals, but haven't necessarily done that in a way that has been appropriately caring for the athletes in those systems or for the other people in those systems. And in my view, that is evidence of having got that balance of what sport should be wrong. We've misshapen it, and we've put winning as the main thing, and in my view, it shouldn't be. And that's partly, I think, why things get kicked out of shape. And for coaches, then I think part of the problem has also been a number of core topics in our coaching lexicon over the last 20 years have been things like athlete-centered coaching, for example. And I remember reading that book for the first time when it came out in the early 2000s, and I remember reading it and thinking, this is wonderful stuff. This is absolutely speaking to what I want to be as a coach. But not very quickly, but over time, I think that there has been some criticism about the theoretical underpinning of that model, and Lynn Kidman sort of posed that it could be holism or humanistic psychology. And the world of coaching didn't really jump on that. And there was obviously a little bit of a disconnect between what people saw to be athlete-centered coaching and maybe holism or humanistic psychology. And differently, but similarly, when Colin Cronin introduced us to the term care in coaching, and he aligned that to Nell Nodding's theory of care, which is lovely. And there are some really beautiful pictures of what it is to be engrossed in the people that you are caring for, or the athletes in our case. But there are some bits missing to both of those conversations, I think. And part of the motivation for this paper and this line of thinking was to say, I think that servant leadership helps us to address some of that misshapenness in our sporting systems, because servant leadership at its heart, the very first beginning of that says, look, in this moment of service of the athletes that you're looking after, identify what is their greatest need and start there. And from the athletes that I'm working with, what I think their greatest need often is just to be assured in their identity that whether they get picked for this tournament or not, whether we beat Germany or not, those things are irrelevant in terms of or should be irrelevant in terms of their self-worth and identity and belief. And the form of Christian spirituality says, look, God loves you. There is no question to that, regardless of what you achieve or whether you get picked or whether you win or whether you lose. There is a God, and he loves you, and he wants to have a relationship with you.
So
is this
identity. So is this, I'm thinking in terms of the contrast, or not in the contrast, but the the leveling up, I suppose, from the athlete-centered approach to the servant leadership, and correct me if I'm wrong then, Don, it's like other-centeredness, because I wonder if we could get into that a little bit just before we get into then, actually, I want you to tell us what you've done, who the coaches were. It seemed like you were kind of learning from coaches who are very clear on where their faith is and the intersection between faith and coaching, and it's kind of seemed like when I read the paper, it's like kind of learning from experts who are who are still grappling with this, but people who have become comfortable and who are in alignment, I suppose, between the job at hand and how they feel emotionally, spiritually, whatever. But like, I think a good bedrock to this is for those that listen, maybe who aren't as familiar with what servant leadership is. There's some components to it, and I wonder, could you map some of that out for us, and then we can start to work back towards where we've arrived at there in a little bit.
Yeah. So servant leadership is. So I've just described the if you like, the foundational starting point of this belief of servant leadership, which is, again, to identify the greatest need of those that you're serving and to work to that. So that is your foundational principle. But there are some other characteristics, and a number of different people have sort of summarized these from Greenleaf's work. Greenleaf was the chap who originally wrote this stuff down, but he didn't do that in a traditionally academic way of giving us a nice framework. So lots of other people have sort of said, well, this is what it is. And in the paper that we're talking about today, I chose to draw on Van Derendonck's, if you like, summary of the literature of the characteristics of servant leadership, which I think are beautiful. So on top of start with this point of service, what is the identify the greatest need of those that you're following and work to that. And then in order to do that, some of those characteristics, empowering and developing people, humility, authenticity, interpersonal acceptance, providing direction, and stewardship. And some of those latter two there, providing direction and stewardship, are, I think, something that servant leadership offers the care in coaching narrative, which perhaps the nodding stuff does not. And I've said noddings is beautiful, but what that was a fairly short-term model of how we care for people originally in a nursing context is where that came from.
I was going to say that was efforts in healthcare, was it?
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
Beautiful. But Greenleaf, if you read Greenleaf's work, I think one of the things that he was brilliant at was saying, look, your job as a leader is to, perhaps better than others, better than most, to point the direction of where we're headed. It's that classic bit of vision casting, but it's that having the foresight, but providing the direction of where we're headed. And I guess I'm trying to be humble with this, but in that sense here, I'm trying to point down the road also with a number of other people in this space who are saying, look, recognize that our sporting systems and our talent development systems, perhaps even more concerningly, are a bit broken at the moment. And there is a danger that in making our talent development systems increasingly organized and adult-led and all of those things, then what we're in danger of doing is breaking that system still further by making those agendas more about what the system wants, as in people who will feed into world-class programs, or what coaches want in order to enable us to progress through the systems and get better jobs and be promoted, rather than being about what the children need, which are really good holistically in the most spiritual sense. I would argue that's part of that as well. What they need is the most holistically caring environment in which to develop and thrive.
Well, that makes complete sense, doesn't it, I suppose, because real holistic development should transcend any institution, any sort of structure, a system as such, and this is sort of trying to bring that back in line with that, because it actually seems, you're making me reflect, it's kind of contradictory to be holistic while operating with the machine in a sense, because the machine's got its agenda. It's polluted, if you will, without, again, it's human nature to have an investment in certain directions that isn't going to be able to touch upon the needs of all in different ways. So, it's pretty cool in a sense.
I just really think we need to keep challenging that and to be conscious that we are in danger of taking this system away from what it really needs to be. And you've also touched on there, and for fear of, and apologies if you're listening, and we're touching on loads of different issues, but that term holistic, I think, is is used in the literature, it's used in the talent development space, and it's used in the positive youth development space, but it's often used to mean physical, psychological, and social, and maybe a bit of emotional health. And almost all of the youth development models, including the ones that I've written about in a couple of the other papers that we're not talking about today, but are in danger of not embracing, in my view, what is truly holistic, but stop at that bit that is almost Western skepticism approved, which might just extend to emotional health and cultural well-being, but doesn't extend to that position of the other. And that phrase you brought up a minute ago, the other, I think is really important. So, in servant leadership, we use the term the other usually to mean the people that we're leading. So we take care of others, and we try and dial into their needs. The needs of the other are more important than ours. That's a key priority in servant leadership. But in spirituality, that term other perhaps means something a bit deeper. It means your relationship with things that are outside of you. And in a Christian sense, that often means your relationship with the divine, with God, and what your purpose in life is relative to that. But in other spiritual disciplines, could be either with other people, or with nature, or with just the other than self.
And then it's sort of, you can kind of understand that then when you say that, Don, to then, even if I compare that to athlete centeredness, and this is where I think there's a manipulative, if it's not in its intention, how it's operationalized, I think is actually more manipulative than what it gets called out for, because a lot of times holistic coaching is seen as a tool to develop skills that we then want to bring back into sport. Whereas holistic coaching is meant to actually transcend beyond sport. So even athlete-centered coaching in a way, and I know it sounds like semantics, but words matter. And certainly when we start to use words to define who we are and how we have value structures, we need to assign meaning to these words that guide our behaviour. That having an understanding of what holistic coaching is at a spiritual level allows coaches probably to truly break free of that system level thought that is trying to eat itself. It's actually, and again, I think that's universal. I think but it's a word, isn't it? We and even where we have seen, and I'm part of this to a point, and probably complicit in some ways as well, of trying to channel the narrative around more psychosocial development. We need more emotional learning, but we never say the word around spirituality. There's never, because it's not seen as it's almost either seen as counted for already, which I think I think at least the way this has resonated with me is there is a distinction. There's something more to that. And if it's not seen as it's not counted for already, it's maybe actually seen as being counter to other things, but it's actually not. It's assisting with what we're trying to do as coaches. It's just trying to put athletes onto a plane of thought, and maybe coaches themselves onto a plane of thought where they have wider perspective on what matters. And I think that's good. I don't think anyone would really argue against that. If we remove the word spirituality and we described it in some other way, we're on board with that. It seems, it's just strange in the way that it's received, but
I think that's really insightful. I think that's exactly the heart of what we're talking about here. And a really good practical example of that would be some of the research in positive youth development would claim to be holistic, but would use, for example, there's a really interesting paper that we could link to this chat, or whatever people are interested, that claims a holistic approach, but then focuses on life skill development of athletes. So has sort of said, look, holistic doesn't just mean technical and tactical, physical, psychological to do with the sport. It also means life skill development. Now, that's fine. Yes, it does include that, but it's still stopping short here of what we are meaning by engagement with the other. And if people listen to this and thinking, this spirituality thing, it's a bit woolly, not sure I'm with that. Well, perhaps a slightly different way of thinking about it that is a well-established line in educational research would be to think about learning as a journey of becoming. And that can also sound slightly remote at times. But so Jarvis wrote about this really, I think, quite profoundly. And what we're saying is there that our journey through sport and learning is actually about reconciling what we are, who we are, and what we're doing in life, and why it matters, and and engaging with that greater sense of purpose. What does my engagement in this England hockey program, for example, really mean? Why does it matter? What is it all about, in a sense? And if we can help young people to better understand their journey in terms of who they are becoming and why that matters, and to help them align their sporting endeavours with their sense of identity, which is grounded in something which is not dependent on being successful or winning or getting selected for this. If we can help them to ground it in something that is much more solid, whatever that might be for them, then I think we are in a much stronger place to do genuinely holistic coaching, essentially.
And is this kind of this jumps out this 100 maybe just to keep the momentum there? Could one of your findings is obviously what you done? You got like 110 coaches. It was like some qualitative questionnaires, wasn't it? These were coaches who were very much actively engaged in their faith, and they were working with athletes of faith, but also not of faith as well, I think. And you were trying to kind of get a sense of, well, what do they grapple with? What do they understand? How do they operationalize? What actually a lot of them did end up calling was their calling, wasn't it? That was one of the findings. They spoke about purpose and calling, and it was actually not just they felt their calling was towards stewardship, but I think also in helping the athletes recognise the gifts they had and to nurture those gifts and to take responsibility for nurturing those gifts, and like all the things that we're talking about discipline, accountability, growth. Like, it was a really, I mean, it's such a great paper to read, because I think it is so real in the way that the interview excerpts, it shows them kind of how they think this through. But that was in the work, I think, wasn't it?
So in this paper we overtly set quite a high bar in terms of people's overt commitment to a Christian worldview. And so we wanted to focus on people who were explicitly Christian in the way that they presented themselves in their professional life. And that was part of what we were going after. And then we said, essentially, now we've recruited you. So you're doing sports coaching at whatever level, and you acknowledge a relatively evangelistic perspective or Christian worldview. Then tell us about your coaching. And so we spent an awful lot of effort trying to send this thing around the world, just to try and capture what was out there. We didn't really have a much understanding of what would come back. It was a really exploratory piece, just going, let's just fire stuff out everywhere with this qualitative survey. And in many ways, it was a bit of an experiment for Andy Parker and I, who is the co-author on this paper as well, because we were trying to use a method which encouraged people to use a lot of words and write as much as they could in a qualitative survey, which is quite challenging at a number level. And so we sent it out and we said, just tell us about your coaching. And you're right that what we got back blew us away, because whilst obviously we came from a Christian worldview, knowing that or believing that there was a real synergy between Christian faith and sport coaching, but the responses blew us away in terms of the depth and level of thought and investment, and the degree to which the coaches, as they wrote back to us, reconciled their Christian faith with their coaching, to the point where so many of them wrote some really beautiful stuff around how they were trying to serve the young people, largely young people, but often it was sort of college sport in America. We got probably more back from universities in America than anywhere else. And if you haven't read this paper and this conversation prompts you to have a look at it, but you're not up for reading the whole thing, what I would encourage you to read first and foremost would just be the extracts that we've included as quotations from the coaches, which for us illustrate in so much richness and depth these people's utter commitment to the young people or to the athletes that they were serving. So whilst we thought there might be a little bit of a wrestle here to say, can we align what they've said to servant leadership? And it just wasn't hard. It was so obviously reflective of their coaching was so obviously reflective of principles of servant leadership. And so many of them wrote back as well, yes, servant leadership is something we overtly follow. We hadn't prompted them to
That's what I
say
was
that at all.
curious about. It was interesting. I didn't get the sense that you were telling them this, help us understand the alignment between it. It seemed like just naturally they were telling you what to do, and that was so aligned with this framework of leadership.
Yeah, it absolutely was that. And so there were three bits that came out of that, as we said. And the first of those was this theme about building the environment, which was really profoundly about building holistic developmental spaces for people to thrive. And that it fitted really well with this concept of service.
And it was tough. It was tough as well, but when it done, that was the thing. It wasn't just wasn't all nice, and it was tough. There was discipline. There was use of authoritarian protocols were required. It was about helping people realise what they can be and pushing them in a way that still allows all the connotations that we associate with coaching. I know some people don't like to use that word authoritarian, but it allowed. There wasn't a separation or in any way some sort of influence that would tell me they wouldn't be competent at their job to do the tough stuff. It was very grounded, very disciplined, but also very caring and nurturing. I think that was which was really cool within that community of space, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
And this gets to, so a really good point of discussion, I think, or some of the perhaps objections that I've heard when I've said to people, this servant leadership stuff is great. This is a really positive model of coaching and something we could use. And some of the kickback that I get perhaps reflects that belief that service is then about being a bit of a doormat or being servile in the nature of just being completely passive or weak. And servant leadership is absolutely not that. There is absolutely a heart of it that has interpersonal acceptance. So it is definitely a pro-social model of coaching, and there is a lot of positive relationships that we're building. But remember, at the heart of this model is, well, what is people's greatest need? And at times, people need a paternalistic sense of discipline. And at times, people need to be pulled back into line. That's their greatest need. At times, I was having a conversation with a coach just yesterday, and she was telling me that what she had done earlier in that day was to call out some really poor behavior from one of her senior players and essentially tell her to get in line because her behavior was disrespectful to the rest of the group and it was damaging the rest of the group. And I said, fantastic. That sounds like a really appropriate thing to do. You haven't been nice there. You've been really stern and disciplined. And that's absolutely what you had to do, because that was the greatest need of that person at that time, to stop damaging the rest of the group by their own egotistical behavior and to be pulled back in. And so these coaches absolutely reflected quite often that their style, if you like, I think on the mat, one of them was clearly a judo coach or something of that description. I can't quite remember now. Was to be quite authoritarian and disciplined in that setting. And there is absolutely a space here to operate in that way, because we are trying to help people with whatever their greatest need might be. At times that might need to be really nice and positive and welcoming, and absolutely there's and I'd say that's probably, there's more of that needed than anything else. But at times there is a need to be tough and to make bold decisions. And that's the position of leadership, isn't it? Sometimes you've got to make difficult decisions that might even be tough for people to take, but it is part of making good decisions for the betterment of the people that you're serving as a whole.
Yeah, and that came through to me quite strongly. I think there was even a story told about some of the athletes that one coach was working with, where they'd lost their parents, and it was there was like a strong sense of like trying to fill a void in some sense, and I think, I don't know if that was. Now, again, it's not necessarily someone that's not of faith wouldn't still have that instinct too, but I think there was a real, again, an alignment there from, strong family figures and taking leadership and having that familial element there, and how we can we can try to compensate for that and bring people in and help people. And I just think, and again, I think that's where there's a real need to understand firmer behaviour where it's done with the best interests. Again, it gives a basis for when we need to be tough, we are. When we need to be nurturing, we are. There's different ways of showing love, and I think it came through very strongly. And I think again, it was just to the credit of someone having, I think, very. And again, universally speaking here for a little moment, very firm anchor points and very firm values and being able to act out of that as a base point. I think where coaches go wrong, and I don't know if this is, I don't want to digress too much here, Don, but I mean, often a lot of the literature around coaching philosophy, it tells you ways to put values together, but it doesn't necessarily ever tell you about what the values should be. You're kind of almost assumed to then kind of create that, and I get that to a point in terms of domain specific knowledge and stuff like that. But we rarely get examples of people actually putting values into action. We rarely get I don't think there's a more cohesive example and illustration of effective coaching philosophy than one probably that is linked to spirituality, because it's so ingrained. When it's done properly, it's so ingrained, it's so vivid, it's not got any conditional elements to it. This is how you act, and it should. And I think what it does also serve is that it gets you down to the absolute fundamentals of what is upwards in your trajectory to what is downward. We don't need to add a lot of other elements to it that maybe go beyond the point of use. It's like they're there, and that was one of the things that came out. There was one of the other findings, Don, I wanted to speak to you about, and this is where I think anyone listening to this, certainly from a Christian view, I think this must be the hardest part. Is it grappling with the element of humility? Because coaching doesn't seem like a practice where humility is often prioritised, or humility is seen as something as a tool that's helpful, because coaches need to be confident. They need to project assertiveness. They need to inspire change in athletes. So it doesn't always seem as if it would lend itself to being humble, because that would, in a sense, be like a sense of what would you call it? A sense of minimizing yourself somewhat, and sort of a sense of like trying to lower your expectations of yourself, and like how does that feed with inspiration towards others? And one of the things that came out, obviously, the paper was that it didn't, and this is where I think a Christian view is very helpful. Because a Christian view on humility isn't that you need to think less of yourself; it's that you need to think about yourself less, isn't it? It's like you actually can project and be proud of the strengths that you have, but use them to serve other people. And I thought that was really, poignant, I think, when it was reflected in what the coaches were saying. How did it feel for you in terms of how you interpreted that? And I know I'm subjectively kind of put my own meaning attached to what I read, but what was your initial reaction to some of that, I wonder?
Yeah, great. Again, you've prompted about 6 different things that I want to say in response. So apologies if this doesn't go quite in a linear order. The first of these is just to really clearly say to people listening that servant leadership is not an exclusively Christian model. And I was one of my reservations about writing this paper and following this line was that people might reconcile the two and therefore write servant leadership off as something that was Christian, and that wasn't their thing. So if I really hope that doesn't happen. It is not. These are not the same things. But what we found was people of the Christian faith really resonated with servant leadership as a model of leadership. But servant leadership is much broader than that, and it can speak to. I think it can speak to everybody, and it can speak to the world of coaching really profoundly in so many ways. And you've highlighted the absolute heart of it there, which is to think of others and their needs before your own. And now that is countercultural for so many of us in the way that we live our lives. And it's a constant struggle for those of us who say, this is what we should do. It's still difficult. It's still a real struggle to think of yourself less and to think about others more. But that absolutely is the challenge of servant leadership. And therefore, I don't have an issue with humility being part of servant leadership and being that person who therefore needs to stand at the front sometimes and either be a disciplinarian or to give a real sense of structure or intent to what we're just about to go and do. So if I'm coaching a team, what the team needs before we go out and we play a game is to understand really clearly what we're trying to achieve, what the plan is. They need to have real confidence in that plan, and they need to have real confidence that they can execute this excellent plan. And that's what they need in that time and that space. And if that needs me to stand at the front and to say that, and to provide that as a person who's done this for a long time, and I have experience with, we've been here lots of times before, and in our accumulative wisdom, this is how we're going to go about it, and to pitch it, then I don't see that as being a problem with humility at all. That is about me being front and center and helping people to understand what we're going to try and do. That is addressing their need at that time. But what I'm trying to do there is to say that's what they need, as opposed to hopefully what I need to do or to be seen to be doing. That's about helping them. So that is absolutely the heart of servant leadership, is to say, what do they need? Let's serve that, and that's more important than our need. And
it wasn't entirely unproblematic, but wasn't it? Because there was an acknowledgement, I think, by some of the coaches around, look, even though they themselves aren't necessarily able to relate to objective measures of success, they were still aware that, look, there are certain tangible elements within the coaching environment around winning, around results, in order for them to stay in their job and maybe again to follow through on their calling, or whatever way they want to conceive of what they do and why they're there. They still had to appreciate the need to win, and that was still, and there's going to be, that's always going to be a conflict, isn't it? And it's but again, I think what was the flip side of that, alongside that, how they mitigated that, I think was quite beautiful in the sense of understanding that we can still work towards inclusivity, we can still work towards, like, respecting our opponent. How do we lose in the right way? How do we win in the right way? And it was sort of still, in a sense, it offered a way of looking beyond what sport is asking you to do and staying in touch with what you feel is the right thing to do. But allowing the things to still coexist in the same space, but that's problematic as well. I don't think, and again, I don't think we need to necessarily, no theory is ever going to. I don't think the point of theory is necessarily to get solutions to things anyway. It's just to allow people to have better reflections on how to manage those paradoxes, isn't it? So and again, you grapple with this, I can imagine, as well, as yourself, Don, and the work you do, in the national setup too. Like, that's always going to be part of it, isn't it? We can't remove that element. Neither should we, perhaps. I mean, if we're in a pursuit of excellence, that, performance benchmarks are helpful towards, in a small way, with an asterisk attached to it, they are indicative of learning and development to a point. And it's, I'm just curious to know your thoughts on that. It's just, it got me thinking a little bit about that stuff.
I think that an appropriate view of competition is central to that. And an appropriate view to competition, in my view, is a conception of competition as a striving together to develop ourselves to the best that we can be. And that is absolutely requires us to compete with everything that we've got. And for our teams, then, we're always going to play to win in the best way that we possibly can. But that won't then become the sole motive. The motive doesn't become winning. It's part of the process. We're trying to win the game. We're going to put everything we've got into it, because that's how we know we're going to make the most of our capabilities and the gifts that we've been given. That's how we're going to thrive. And I think people would really clearly recognize that sport is only valuable when we have competitors who are able to push us. Nobody wants to win 5-0 every week. And if winning becomes easy, then it's pointless. We don't want that. That isn't what sport should be about. Sport should be about competitive, collaborative development. And that means we need to play in my context, we need to play other international teams who push us to the very limits of our capability, because that's when we're going to be able to learn and thrive the most. And so a little picture of this, I remember from last year's Easter tournament. We're just coming up to this year's Easter tournament, but last year's Easter tournament, we welcomed Spain and Ireland to our base in Lilleshall in the UK. And Spain, particularly, are a team, or who were a team last year. We were just really evenly matched with Spain. And I remember standing on the side of the pitch, and in the final game of that series, and it was the deciding game. And I think we were winning 4-2 at the time or something. And it was just the most magnificent game where the both teams were playing their socks off. It was the best hockey we'd ever played. Both teams were absolutely loving it, thriving it. It was really competitive, played in a really good spirit. It was absolutely everything that sport should be. And I remember just sitting on the side going, this is joy, isn't it? To watching these young people thrive in this environment, to play their socks off, to love being in this game. And the fact that Spain then scored two and we ended up drawing 4-4 and didn't win the game was a minor irritation next to the sense that it had just been the most wonderful competition. And absolutely, we wanted to win that game and we played to win it. But the learning and the thriving that came out of that for me was much more profound.
And would you say, I think this might again be the advantage of a Christian worldview on winning the right way and losing the correct way, because if you're, what I get the sense, Don, from yourself, and also I think from reading the papers and I've been exploring what the other coaches and how they perceive competition, was that clearly if we're trying to move towards a space of excellence, we have to connect with what winning is on a deeper level, so that would remove the temptation for more superficial forms of winning, and in terms of cheating, in terms of like gamesmanship, in terms of like disrespect towards others, if it's opponents. There are that we can't win unless we win justly, and this is about justice to a degree, isn't it? And actually, also winning can be reflected therefore on how you handle losing, or how you handle altercation, because a Christian view on things is that if someone does bad to you, it's about forgiveness, and it's actually that's the measure of someone, is how you act in the face of that disrespect back, and that offers so much, and again it offers so much opportunity, I think, that worldview on how, and connection. And again, this is where I think we started on this at the very start, Don, about the religious viewpoint and a citizenship viewpoint, maybe more universally. They aren't separate things. Like, this is what coaches are telling athletes all the time. But again, what we do see, the added strength of a Christian viewpoint is that connecting firmly with a faith and with your value structure, it helps you to supervise that, it helps you to teach that, and helps the athletes hopefully to live that, and how they think about winning and how they think about defeat and the wider purpose of sport. And it all flows so well. And I think what's just so great, and I just generally thank you, Don, obviously for doing this piece of work, because it seems like, regardless of religious viewpoint or not, people are told conflicting messages that you have to either be very grateful and not want to achieve anything, or be super narcissistic and you'll be cutthroat in everything that you do. And it's like, we need something to bridge ambition with humility. We need something to bridge gratitude with perseverance. We need things that can bring these things together. And it's really, whether someone, and this isn't about trying to convert people to Christian faith. I don't think it's like that. This is just, but I really think it's trying to get people to recognise that they can understand more about the commonalities of viewpoints if they work harder on cementing a strong value structure for themselves, and one that they live and breathe, and one that they can pass on to other people. Because that's the beauty of sport. I think you said it yourself, like, it's incarnate to what sport is meant to be, is about people trying to grow themselves and in all the right ways. And it's really interesting that we can see a conversation that's based within spirituality and religion actually helping us deepen our understanding of more conventional topics of ethics, of relationship, of goal setting, all the things that we're talking about. I think we touched on this earlier on, that no, we aren't talking about this element, the spirituality element, even though we want all these other things to happen. And actually the spirituality element could be what unlocks better outcomes in the emotional turbulence of how you react to that, in the relational element of sport, how you work with teammates, how you work with officials, all the things that we want young people to do, all the things that we want senior athletes to model. It's all, where there's a gap, we can perhaps bridge it with more of a spiritual outlook, so yeah, and I don't know if there's been anything that we haven't maybe managed to chat to yet, Don, that you want to fill in at this stage of the conversation.
I think you've been quite perceptive there in outlining some models of how we think about sport. And I think this is really important, because the if you like, the common person, layperson narrative of what elite sport looks like. It looks tough. It looks a bit nasty at times, and it looks sometimes like the coach does have to be, really authoritarian and quite mean at times. And we know that lots of people who win are like that. If you look at sport through history, then I sometimes use the example, people can look this up if they're listening to it, of Viktor Turkanov, who was the absolute dictator of Soviet ice hockey when the Soviets were the best in the world for several Olympics in a row. You can win by doing it that way. And I think then the danger then becomes that people then say, well, it's either that or it's this nice stuff over here that is servant-hearted and spirituality and a bit fluffy. And therefore it's winning or fluffiness. And these two are somehow at different ends of the scale. And my message here, I think, is it absolutely isn't that. Because what we know about human flourishing and what we know about people who perform to their absolute best is not in this Machiavellian narcissistic, well, that is not how people thrive. And in fact, that's what I think we've seen in some of the sporting models around the world that have succumbed to that win at all costs mentality, is that you end up breaking people and breaking systems to horrific extents. And what I'm saying is, I think there are other ways to do this. And servant leadership for me is a really great model whereby we can help people to thrive and to find great meaning in what they're doing, and therefore to flourish and be their best, and therefore win and be successful without necessarily having to think that it's this either or we're some other end of the spectrum. I think there is a great place to say we can help people to thrive, and servant leadership gives us a great anchor for that, because, and I love that term, I'm going to keep using that you've given us. It gives us a really strong framework. And the danger that perhaps this might help to counter in some people is the narrative that is out there that says, well, there's a time and a place for everything. For example, you can use your judgment to make this decision or this decision based on and almost anything goes if you can rationalize it in this particular context. There's a danger.
Yeah,
There's a
that's
real
dangerous.
danger in that,
Yeah.
I think. And I've challenged in several of the things that I've written this notion of cherry picking, which also comes, I think, from a very healthy and positive perspective of saying to people, well, there perhaps isn't a right way to do this, and there isn't people will find their own truth and etc. And that's and I'm with that. But what this kind of framework gives us is that anchor to say, well, there is a real grounding to what is and isn't okay here. And yes, there's still judgment in here about what is the ultimate need to the people that you're serving, and how do you then respond to that, and how do you lead in that environment. But it also probably says there are some things which are off the table, and these elements are inappropriate, and these are bits that we're going to challenge. There is never a place for Machiavellianism. There is never a place for narcissism. There is never a place for putting winning on such a pedestal that it becomes the be all and end all of any environment. And those are the things that
and is that before, Don, we even add in a Christian element? Because I think this is about the benefits of servant leadership, isn't it? That just, you'll probably get it right more times you get it wrong if you just work under the fundamental condition of serving what others are thinking and what they require first, because then it's just not vulnerable to your own, human ignorance or selfishness or those sorts of things. And then if we can further embolden that by having a backdrop of Christian belief as well, if people choose to use that, if that's also important to them. Great. Where do you think this is going to go? Obviously, there's been some years passed since this paper was released. Has there been any traction in this space, both in terms of understanding servant leadership, or have you at least seen this framework of leadership more prevalent, or is it stagnated? And equally, has the Christian worldview within sports coaching also followed up behind that, or is it kind of went adrift? What's your insights been in the literature so far, or even the impact in real world setting?
Well, this will shock us all to learn that this particular paper didn't necessarily spark a revolution in terms of the volume of writing of servant leadership. It continues to sort of, I guess, potter away within the broader lexicon of leadership. But I think there is a healthy branch of people who are pursuing servant leadership as their chief discipline of study. For me, this becomes one part of a broader narrative of trying to understand great coaching that is both for me, but also that I'll then write about. So I'm continuing my work in servant leadership. We published a couple of other things off the back of what we did with this, but more recently we've turned our attention, as we've talked perhaps a little bit more today, perhaps it's reflective of where we've gone, looking at talent development spaces and how we can use this framework to perhaps better inform some of those talent development spaces and address some of the shortcomings of, in my view, positive youth development models as they currently are, and the claims to holistic development within those models that aren't yet scratching the itch that I think we can really help people with. So for me, servant leadership becomes part of that ongoing evolution of appropriate talent development space coaching.
It got me thinking. I mean, I had a recent conversation with Andy Kirkland on the podcast about a salutogenic approach to talent development, and that's about trying to understand the life course of someone and a health-based approach to talent. And that in itself, I think we are all going towards this space where I think that old word of holistic development that was just taken at face value is starting to be picked at a little bit more, and we're starting to. And I think with servant leadership is we need to come back to it. Clearly, it's given maybe an alternative base point in which to build upon that maybe isn't as played by the system of sport or played by maybe individual propensity towards self-serving, motivations. And then what you've brought, and I think this is why I'm so glad, Don, and we've had this conversation to bring this paper back to light, is the Christian viewpoint is now served as a really effective case study, at the very least, for the utility of a servant leadership framework. And beyond that, it also, I think, helps us recognise, I think, a voice within the coaching demographic that isn't actually given enough care, I think, towards. I think we need to recognise that there's so many Christians in the world that are trying to do good but are wrestling with their own problems as performers. And I talk all the time in the podcast about we need to care more for coaches. And I think what you've brought through this work is an awareness of the battles that feeling like the world doesn't assimilate to your viewpoint can bring, and how you wrestle with that, and in a way that's inclusive and tolerant, and helps you do the work that you think is your calling. So I just think it's a beautiful piece of work, and I just hope that we start to see more of it. Don, I can only thank you, for coming in and sharing it with us. It's been great chatting to you about this sort of topic.
Thanks, Mark. I've enjoyed it from start to finish.
Excellent. No, great. And for those that are listening, guys, I hope you found that conversation as useful for you as it certainly was for me, and I hope it's got you thinking a little bit. And please, by all means, share it with other people that you think it could touch and have meaning towards, and also perhaps other people who you think maybe wouldn't necessarily want to tune into a conversation that has that title of Christianity over it, but we can always expose ourselves to different types of information and viewpoints, and I think that's really, really important, and it's certainly one of the missions of this podcast. So excellent, guys. Thanks again, Don, and we will see you next time. Thank you.